Hi. Hey. This video is about, it's supposed to be an overview of CSS Grid, an introduction to CSS Grid. So at this point, you've experienced Flexbox. You've become familiar with Flexbox. And so we should talk about what's the difference between Flexbox and CSS Grid. Remember, we're talking about things that help us actually create a layout in for a web page, whereas normally if we don't do anything, one thing just stacks on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. It's just like a Word document or something like that. So we have these two modules we can use, these two technologies. We have Flexbox and we have CSS Grids. Now, Flexbox is good for aligning things in one dimension. So horizontally or vertically, you can align them, you can control the space between them. You can even take one element and align it to the side or to the top or the bottom and control it that way. So it's good for just aligning things in general in a one-dimensional space. CSS Grid gives us two dimensions. We can create columns and we can create rows. And then we can place items on that grid however we want. We can have things span a couple rows, be a little bit wider. We have span a couple columns, span a couple rows. And we can create a layout module that's much more robust and powerful. And these two are used together very well. Kind of use CSS Grids to do the overall layout of your page, the larger sections of your page. And then inside of those sections, you might have some flexbox going on to get things to line up inside of those sections. Or you might have another grid inside of one of your grid items. That can happen too. So let's talk about CSS Grid. So first, okay, let's imagine a layout like this. Let's see, I should probably, screw it, I'll leave it like this. A layout like this, where you've got things in different positions and different sizes. How do we do that? Well, with CSS Grid, what we do is we create a grid. So there's a grid. There's a grid. And we have defined that grid in our CSS, and we have told it how many columns and rows we want it to have. And that's our grid. So the thing that we have created is a grid container. So again, just like Flexbox, the idea of a container and then parent children, the items, the Flex container and the Flex items is really important here. So you have to create a parent container before you can have actual items, grid items to place on the grid. And the items have to be the direct children of the container. So you might have other items, like say you have this block here and you have other stuff inside of it. Anything inside of that item, you can't place it on the grid. It just stays inside of that item. So it's only the direct children that are treated as grid items. So if you can see here, inside of this body tag, we have a header, we have a main, we have an aside, we have a footer. These 1, 2, 3, 4, those can be grid items. Those can be placed on the grid. Inside of here, article with an H1 and some P tags and a figure tag, this is not available to place on the grid. It's going to stay inside of the main container. Now, we haven't gone over the body tag yet. We will when we get outside of CodePen. Right now, CodePen, the body tag is the tag when you have an HTML file. The body tag is the tag where all the stuff in your page goes inside of. It's like the main tag. In CodePen, where you're typing your HTML right now, it serves as the body tag. So when you see, in some tutorials, they show the body tag. That's what's going on. So now that we have a grid, we can take the items and place them, they're like cells. You can place them in a cell, or we can actually create a grid area by spanning a couple rows and a couple columns. So that's what you would call these cells and areas. And so here, or just all areas. Here's an example of, you have an area here, an area here, an area here, an area here. And again, this is meant to break up the overall structure of your page. So for your project, you might have a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be contained in one area. So you would create a big container for all of that stuff, and then maybe you need a little container over here, depending on your design. Another thing that's important to understand is these tracks here, these columns, have line numbers, and they start at 1 and they go to 6. So the first line here is line 1, then line 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this is how you tell an element where to go on the grid. So if you want something to be right here, let's say, you would say start at line 3, go start at column line 3 and go to column line 4, start at row line 2 and go to row line 3. And that's a very explicit way of saying just go right there. Or you could tell it to go from 3 to 5 for the column, and then you'd be spanning 2 columns. You can do that, but understanding these line numbers is very important. There's also this concept of explicit versus implicit. And this will make more sense a little bit later, but in the sense where I was just saying, if you tell something to go exactly between this line and this line and this line and this line, that's a very explicit way of telling an element where to go. You're telling it exactly where to go. Whereas if you don't tell it where to go, there's a certain flow to the grid that you'll experience with this example that I'm about to give you. So I'm going to jump over to a code pen that I have set up already. And it's got some styles in it. So you can see here we've got a class of grid container. And inside of it are 5 elements, 5 divs. And they have some styles down here just to give them the font and the padding and the color and everything. But they're just divs. They're just divs. So in order to turn these boxes into elements on the grid, the first thing we need to do is tell the container that it is a grid. Remember, it's got to be the parent element that has this property, display grid. Okay, so I've turned it into a grid, but we don't see anything yet. We're not seeing anything, and that's because it is a grid, but by default, we're only getting 1 column and then however many rows it needs to create to put the elements in there. So in order to see something, we need to start creating columns. And we do this with this property here, grid template columns, grid template columns. And the value that we're going to give it, well, it's tempting to just say, oh, I want 3 columns, so you just type number 3. That doesn't work. We need to tell it how wide we want those columns to be. So I could say something like 200 pixels and then put a space and then say 30%, or you can use any units of measurement you want, and then, you know, maybe 100 pixels. And so I'm going to have 3 columns, each with these units of measurement. So unit of measurement, space, unit of measurement, space, unit of measurement. That's going to create 1, 2, 3 columns. One thing that was created when CSS Grid came out is this whole new unit of measurement called the FR, and FR stands for fraction. So I'll just show you 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. That just created 3 rows of equal width. So an FR is just kind of like saying one part this, one part that, one part the other thing. It's like a recipe, like when you're making rice, right? It's like 2 parts water to 1 part rice. So I could actually, if I wanted the middle column to be larger, I could say 2 FR, and then all of a sudden that middle. One thing we can do to visualize these columns better is we can put a gap in between all the boxes so you can see them better. And you can either say like grid column, you can say grid column gap, like 1M. And that puts, and you can also do grid row gap if you want to do, or you can just say grid gap 1M. And that does both the rows and the columns at the same time. So in this situation, we've created a grid with 3 columns. And notice I haven't defined any rows yet. And that's the difference between explicit and implicit. Implicitly, it's just going to create another row for however many items I have. It's just going to create them for me. But I can go in and I can control that as well. I can say grid template rows, and then I can say how wide I want these to be. So I could say 200 pixels by 400 pixels, and I would get something like that. But if you don't declare the rows, they just happen automatically, and they're the height of whatever content is inside of them. So I'm going to turn that off for now, and I'm just going to leave it the way it is with the padding determining the height. The padding and the font size are determining the height of these rows. So from here, now that we have this, we've set up our grid container. Remember, notice we haven't done anything to the individual items. We've only placed properties on the grid container itself. So display grid, grid template columns, grid gap. Those are the 3 things we've done, and we've created a grid. Now, let's say we want to start, I'm going to change this to 1 FR. Now let's say we want to start placing things on the grid in different locations. Well, let's say I wanted number 5 here to actually be at the top. In that case, I would say class equals 5, right? Okay, I'm looking up here and it says class 5. So down here, I'm going to put my selector and say .5, so that I'm selecting that class, that element with that class. And I'm going to say grid columns 1. Well, there's different ways to do it. I can say grid, not grid columns, sorry, grid column start is 1. And that moves it down there. So it's not moving it up into the corner. I'm just telling it to start at the first column. And then I can say grid column end. In this case, I'll say 2. And nothing's changed because by default, it only spans 1 column or 1 row. But another way to write this to save space is you could just say grid column 1-2. And you can see there, it does the same thing. Because we're going by the line numbers. Remember, this is line number 1, this is number 2, 3, and 4. So if I wanted it to span across 2 columns, I would say start at line 1 and end at line 3, and it would do that. Now let's say I did want it to go up into the top here. Then I would need to explicitly tell it which row to go to. So grid row, and again, you can do grid row start and grid row end, But if you just do grid row, you can do both of them at the same time. So I'm going to say grid row 1. And actually, that's all I had to say, because the default for how many to span is just 1 row, 1 column. So I could say 1-2, and it would do the same thing as it is right now by default. So I really only had to say grid row 1 to get it to go up there. Let's see, what else can I show you? Let's say we wanted, let's stop that for now. That's the basics of it. You create a grid container, and then you can take the individual items and move them around. Let's at least do one. Oh, another way, let me back up. Another way of saying, getting 5 to go across 2 columns, I can say column 1/3, or I could also say column 1/span 2. And that's telling it to span 2 columns, and that does the exact same thing. So let's say I wanted number 1 up here to span across 2 rows. I would say target the class of 1. So that would be my selector, because up here I noticed that it has a class of 1. So I'm going to write 1 down here. And I'm going to say grid row 1 span 2, and there it span 2, and it jumped the last one. It had to go down to another row, so it created another row for that other item to go to. So I know this doesn't look like much, but once you get some height into these things, once you start putting stuff into these things, you're gonna create a large structure for your page. So you can place some things over on this side, some things over on this side, and you might have a much more complicated set of rows and columns. Another thing I should point out is that you can have a grid inside of a grid. So let's say we had a couple of things inside of one here, or you could use Flexbox inside of a grid. So inside of one here, I'm going to put 2 divs with the class of box. And let's see, down here, I'll give some styles to box. Border 1 pixel solid white. So it's got a couple styles in there. I can turn this, if I wanted them to be side by side, I could either use Flexbox, that would work. So if I went up here and I said display flex, it would put them side by side right there. That would work. Or I could turn it into a grid. I could say display grid, and then I would need to create columns. Let's see, grid template columns, and I'll give it 2 columns, 1 FR, 1 FR. This is gonna create a problem here. Yeah, the problem here is that I have the word 1, and then I also have these. So remember, it's only the direct children of the container that are treated as grid items. And I have this word 1 just hanging out. It doesn't have any tags around it, but the browser is going to put some like temporary tags on it because it's got to do something with it. It doesn't know what to do with it. So it's going to treat it like an element. So if I got rid of that, then I would have a grid that I could start using to design more detailed compositions inside of. So that's an example of putting a grid inside of a grid. For your assignment, you'll actually be using this code pen here and starting with this and creating a series of layouts from screenshots that I've posted. So again, the parent-child relationship is very important. The container is what gets grid, display grid, and then grid template columns. This is a property of the parent container. And then grid column and grid row are properties of the child element, the grid item that gets placed on the grid. So it's important to remember the difference between the parent and the child. Very, very important. A really, really, really common mistake for people just starting out with grid. All right, shoot me any messages if you have questions about this, and it's going to take practice. It's not completely intuitive, but once you get the hang of it, it's very powerful. It's kind of the best way to actually create a layout on your page and not have everything just stack on top of each other, but actually be able to make white space. Oh my God, make white space. You never see pages with white space. And place things down in the corner or to the side or wherever you need them to be to really organize your page. So it's worth taking the time to invest in that time to get to know it and master it as much as possible. All right, I hope this helps and we'll speak again.